In today's video, I'm going to be telling you why Zone 2 heart rate training doesn't work for beginners. As an exercise physiologist, I am so keen on the research, the data, the latest literature into training methodology and training principles, and we know that heart rate training is so well researched, and we can see across elite, sub-elite, recreational populations that training a majority of the time in a low heart rate zone with a little bit of intensity and some higher heart rate zone mixed throughout, we see fantastic results. But why doesn't this work for beginners? Now, for context, most of the research focuses on 3 zones, and they correlate with the first and second lactate threshold. But in contrast, Strava, Garmin's, and most of us recreational runners are familiar with the 5-zone model. So zone 1, for most of us, this would be more like a walk, maybe a light cycle, a swim. For some more well-trained athletes, this could be a really comfortable, easy jog. Zone 2 is what we're going to focus on today, being a comfortable, conversational pace, still a low heart rate, something we can sustain for hours and hours. And this is where the problem lies. Moving into zone 3, we have our tempo zone. This is where things start to get a little bit quicker, a little bit harder, a little bit faster. For most of us recreational runners, this could be roughly our 10k or hour pace. For elites, this is more like their half marathon pace. Moving into zone 4, things get harder again. This is called our threshold training. We're working a little bit harder. We can't sustain it quite as long. We're no longer able to have a conversation, but we can get a couple of words out. And finally, zone 5. Short, fast, hard. Sprints, short intervals, no chatting, not comfortable, but good if you want to go quick. So it's been great over the last few years to see this really big shift from people going out and just running as hard as possible on every run. And for a lot of beginners or people just starting out, they'd go for a run and have no understanding about the zones or pacing, and they'd finish a run being completely gassed and exhausted and think, why would anyone do this? But we've now had this really significant shift to a really strong focus on zone 2 training, which is fantastic. It makes training much more sustainable, it's easier to manage, there's a reduced injury risk, it's more comfortable, it's more fun, it's more social. Overall, I'm a massive fan of zone 2 training, but I think the problem lies in focusing on heart rate when you're a beginner. Now, as someone that's new to running or getting back into running after an injury, your heart rate data is probably going to be much higher than a recreational, more experienced or elite runner. So what a lot of people do is they sign up to a training program, or they do a little calculator online, or they look at their running watch and it gives them these heart rate zones. And for a lot of people, I see this really strong focus on 140 beats per minute. There seems to be this unreasonable and incorrect blanket rule that 140 beats per minute is this magic number, and if you're below that, you're cruising. If you're above that, you're working hard. Now, we're just not that simple. As creatures, as humans, we're not that simple, and we're not that similar. There's so much individual variance. We can't just have any of these blanket rules. We have to be really specific and individual. So why does it matter? What is the issue with new runners trying to focus on these heart rate zones? The issue is their physiology and cardiovascular system have not yet adapted to match these traditional or expected or predicted heart rate zones. So unless they're getting physiological testing through a VO2 max mask test or through a lactate threshold test, both very invasive, both very expensive, both kind of unnecessary as a beginner unless you've got time and money to spare. So by using these predicted heart rate numbers or focusing on this 140 beats per minute, we're setting ourselves up for failure, because unless you have a really strong fitness background, unless you are a footy player or a soccer player or a swimmer or a cyclist prior to coming into running, your cardiovascular system takes some time to adapt. And so as a beginner, you might go for your first run and you might be trying to stick to zone 2, but your heart rate goes way higher. So you might have done a bit of research, looked up best way to train, and come across the heart rate training principle. You then go outside for your first run and you try and get your heart rate under 140. 130 or whatever number you figured out. And all of a sudden your heart rate's at 160. So what do you do then? Do you just walk? Do you stop running? Do you take a rest? Do you break it up into walk, jog intervals? Or do you just keep going at that 160? Now I think for a lot of people, this process can be really disheartening because you've done all this research, you've done all this preparation, you're ready to go, do you want to do it right? You want to do it specific and carefully, and then you start running and your heart rate's almost at maximum. How do we then make sure our training's sustainable? How do we then follow these principles and do our running training safely when our heart rate is just so high because our body hasn't adapted yet? And this is where we need to let go of these heart rate zones until they're appropriate. And when we're at an appropriate fitness level for them to apply, I think it's an incredible way to monitor and prescribe your training. But until that point, I think it leads to a lot of disappointment, a lot of confusion, and ultimately I'm sure a lot of runners have given up because they just haven't seen those results, or their heart rate is just not what they're trying to get it to be. Number 1, don't worry so much about your heart rate. It's okay. Over time, it will improve, it will lower at a relative effort. So let's say at the moment, you're running 7-minute pace and your heart rate's at 160. In 6 months' time, you'll probably be able to run that same pace and it will feel much more comfortable and your heart rate might be 10, 20 beats lower. So we've got to wait for those changes. But in the meantime, how do we get there? Now, for any of the scientists out there, this might seem super counterintuitive and going against the research, but unfortunately, well, even fortunately, it's not even a bad thing. You're going to have to spend some time in these higher heart rate zones. You might be doing your slow or easy jog in zone 3 or zone 4 heart rate, and that's okay. It's totally fine. It doesn't matter that much. I think as runners, we get really caught up and obsessed with the data and doing everything perfectly and making sure we're doing the right thing, which is great and definitely has its time and place. But when you're just starting out, getting out the door, putting your shoes on, going for a jog is far more beneficial than worrying that you're a couple of beats over the zone 2 heart rate that you've been told you need to hit. Now, another issue that comes up with this is even just simply the terminology we use. And what I told you at the start about zone 2 being conversational and chatty and comfortable, that's just not the case for a lot of people. For a lot of people, going for a run as slow as they possibly can is the hardest thing they've ever done. They're not able to have a chat and a conversation, and that's totally fine. So we need to rethink how we are framing this to our beginner runners or to our friends who are just getting started, because it would be quite disheartening to tell someone, oh yeah, come for a run with me. It'll be easy, it'll be chatty, it'll be comfortable. Meanwhile, they're working as hard as they possibly can, waiting for it to be over. So my advice is go out for that run. Keep it as slow as you possibly can. As slow as you think you can, then go even slower. Make it as comfortable as you can, because this will ensure that your heart rate is as low as you can possibly manage at that time, which therefore means we're going to get those aerobic and cardiovascular responses that we're looking for without necessarily being in our zone 2 heart rate, because it's just not that deep. It just doesn't matter that much. And as a general rule, for fitter, more experienced runners, absolutely spend 80% of your time in zone 2. But when we're just starting out, let's not get too caught up in it. Let's just put the shoes on and start running, and the zone 2 will come later. The other approach we can take is breaking our runs down into walk, jog intervals. Jog for a minute, walk for 2 minutes. Whatever interval you can manage, whatever you can sustain and not feel completely gassed at the end, run that distance or duration, rest as long as you need, and go again. Again, we don't have to be too specific. Go off how you feel and try and over time increase the duration of the running sections and reduce the duration of the rest. Now, using an RPE scale can be a really helpful way to keep you on track, but in this case, unlike heart rate data, RPE is a little bit subjective, so you've really got to figure out what your scale looks like to you, because an 8 to me is not an 8 to you. But as long as your 8 is consistent, doesn't matter what mine is. The trouble I see with this is that, again, for a beginner, going out for a run can be really hard, so everything might feel like a 10. So how do we encourage or decipher or differentiate between a run that feels like a 10 and a run that feels like an 8? Because again, in order to keep things sustainable, we need to keep things really as comfortable as we can. And comfortable just might not be a word that you associate with running if you're just getting started. So just trying to maybe look at your pace and think like, okay, if 8-minute pace is really hard for me, can I go 8:30 or whatever it is? Try and just go as slow as possible, making sure you're still jogging and still running. So we're practicing the skill of running, taking breaks as you need, and this will help to keep things sustainable and enjoyable. I'd love to open up the discussion in the comments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you hate everything I just said? Is it making sense? Have you got more questions? Really keen to chat about it, because I think it's just something that isn't really spoken about. I think we hear all the time about these zones, and I don't think we often hear how to apply that. And in this particular case, in this very specific circumstance or setting, I don't think it quite applies as it might to the majority of the running population.